and exposure to the best practices of Indian Armed Forces, and offer them an opportunity to study in the various institutions, military institutions all across the Indian country, whether it is the Staff College or the highest organization, that is the National Defense College. So over the years, n number of African personnel and officers have been trained in Africa, in India, on dealing with how to deal with
concept, a strategy going for how South-South cooperation can be brought about in addressing these issues. And I think what has struck me most is that how similar this is to the development process. For example, we have realized that it is very important for the countries that are affected to have the ownership of the process. And also that it is very important to have a multi-sectoral approach to peace building. In the case of the United Nations system, all UN agencies coming aboard to address the issue. And also we have realized that it is important to have prevention, just like in disaster reduction. You have to have prevention before it happens. And in case it happens, during the process of addressing it, you have to be looking at prevention for the future. And then even if you manage to arrest the conflict, you have to work all the time to be able to prevent a recurrence of the conflict. Now, I wanted to mention one very little thing about South-South cooperation and the way that we engage countries, the protagonists. I think we've had a lot of experiences where from the north, we tend to point out at countries when we think they are erring. We tend to have conditionality, we introduce sanctions. But if you look at it from a cultural context, and particularly from the south, the region that I've been working in, it's very important for people not to lose faith. And therefore, you cannot shout at people in public and say, change your ways. It might be better to use another avenue where you use friends, use peers, and I think this is the context in which we can bring South-South cooperation to bear in this instance. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Dennis, for, first of all, reminding us of the prevalence of violent conflict in the world, particularly in the South, and the tension. I also find your point very interesting on the tensions, potential tension between the principle of non-interference and responsible sovereignty, because then there may be situations where the community of nations may want to move in and exert certain pressure on governments that are not fulfilling their responsibility, their sovereign responsibilities. And I think that's a very fascinating point to explore. And then I also would want to mention, and then maybe we can hear more about this later in the discussion point, that your office, UN Office for South-South Cooperation, and UNDP, you sort of coordinate a network, a global network on South-South cooperation. And I noticed through email communication lately that you have set up a working group to bring together, to draw together the knowledge and the experience in this area. So I think that would be interesting to hear more about it at a later stage. Okay, now with this, we turn to the next speaker, Mr. Carlos. The floor is yours.
As I was saying, it's a privilege to be here, and I would like to thank RIS for making this possible, and thank you all for your time. Please note that the views I'm going to express here this afternoon do not necessarily reflect the official positions of the Pandiaka Lodgers Institute, where I work I'm a career policy specialist, but I'm on leave now. I'm affiliated to Taiwan National University as a sabbatical. I still represent in this event the institute because I still have a formal affiliation with them, even though I'm on sabbatical. I know it may sound complicated, but that's how it works, how I got to be here. With this in mind, I would like to humbly offer basically two contributions to this conference. The first one is theoretical. After this morning sessions, it's actually easier to say what I'm going to say. I'm going to echo some of the views expressed here, especially the one related to the need of theorizing South-South cooperation, as opposed to those those who believe that we don't need to theorize, or we don't need theories about South-South cooperation. And as remarkably as it may sound, we've seen commentators, not only in this conference, but in previous conferences, saying that to what extent we need theories of South-South cooperation. And maybe one basic argument is how can we support any policy today without evidence, without theories, without science? They are all interlinked. I also agree with the argument according to which it's necessary to challenge some basic assumptions of international relations theory as far as South-South cooperation is concerned. Sorry, I had a PowerPoint presentation, but I forgot. It's okay. It's fine. I can make it available later. I just forgot about it. No. It's fine. It's fine. Sorry about that. Well, I was talking about assumptions that we need to challenge because of the emergence of South-South cooperation, especially the successful kind. And maybe because those assumptions, they were created or constructed or crafted during the Cold War or immediately after the Cold War. And they do not make sense anymore in a world that is rapidly changing as today. One of those assumptions is based on the costs of non-cooperation. For those who are not familiar with theories of cooperation, the traditional ones, they're all based in game theory, in which there is a particular kind of rationality. For one to win, the other one has to lose, or you have to optimize gains for both to win, and etc. You have a large body of literature about this. However, some recent developments have shown, especially related to so-called stochastic games and other forms of rationalities, that sometimes people cooperate just because it's good to cooperate. And it's based more on principles and feelings and not necessarily in immediate or automatic payoffs. Another assumption is that security issues, they are more important than any, according to certain approaches of international relations. And as we can notice from already a long period of time, these assumptions, they don't hold. We can think of collective international action playing a fundamental role in achieving today arguably the most prosperous and peaceful moment in history of humankind in terms of international conflict. We hear the news, we listen to the news every day and watch the news, and all we see is war, but fact is, in terms of casualties, we live in arguably the most peaceful time. The problems and the mortality is coming from mostly interstate conflicts. So this is one of the issues that we might bear in mind. My second humble contribution is empirical. There has been a growing body of research that focuses on successful cases of South-South cooperation, yet they seldom deal with these main issues. Issues such as non-proliferation. In a nutshell, contrary to Western narratives, the Global South is not only about creating rogue nuclear states such as North Korea or Iran. to name a few. Fact is that there are excellent cases of non-proliferation arising from the global south. I would like to point out 3 relevant arguments / examples. First, we shall always remember that the only country who voluntarily denuclearized was South Africa. However, even in the global south, interest for this theme is virtually non-existent. Also, most nuclear-free zones are located in the global south. Regardless the enormous pressures made by central countries in that direction of creating such free zones, they would not have come into fruition if it wasn't for political will and political engagement from the global south. In other words, they do not exist just because the North wanted them to exist, but because the global south in general bought the idea. A third argument example in the particular case of non-proliferation is one of my favorites with regards to the Brazilian-Argentine Agency for Accounting and Control of Nuclear Materials. For those who don't know, Brazil and Argentina, they were competing regional in South America and Latin America powers in the 60s and the 70s, and they had military nuclear programs. If you don't know, they were terminated in the 80s. And one of the byproducts, one of the outcomes of this whole political process of, first of all, giving up on nuclear armaments, obviously with enormous pressures from the international community, but if it wasn't for the fact that both countries also bought this idea, we wouldn't have one of the largest nuclear-free zones in the world, which is based on the Treaty of Tlatelolco, which encompasses basically the whole of Latin America. And this agency, which is considered one of the benchmarks for nuclear approachment, and oftentimes is used as a benchmark case for India and Pakistan or North and South Korea as an institutional framework. So I highly recommend those who are interested in this issue to do research about ABAC, which is the Argentina-Brazilian agency that I just mentioned. Apart from non-proliferation, there is also peacekeeping. Maybe I should go there and just show, I still have time? 2 minutes. Yeah, just show a map. Yeah. I'm sorry. Well, in any case, this chart shows the ranking of contributors by country to peacekeeping operations, UN. Remembering that we have peacekeeping operations according to other regional organizations, such as the American Organization of American States. These are only UN, and most of the donors for peacekeeping are from the South. However, the 20 largest arms exporters in this recent time frame are largely from central northern countries. To conclude with a very simple example of bilateral defense cooperation between, there are a number of studies that show this particular kind of cooperation, bilateral defense cooperation, usually involving military aspects, training, exchange of information and techniques and joint exercises. They have a collateral, they have an impact, positive impact on security as a whole, and also on development assistance. So this is one of the best cases for already a large quantity of evidence, scientific, that bilateral defense cooperation may be one mechanism to further international cooperation as a whole in these security issues, and also development assistance. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks a lot, Carlos, for your points on the need to theorize South-South cooperation, and then the empirical evidence and the examples which you cited. I'm particularly, of course, struck by your reference to the Argentina-Brazilian institutional agency, which then handled the nuclear control, if I understood correctly, and that you feel that it provides lessons learned for other regions and conflicts, possibly India, Pakistan. That's something that maybe we can address in other presentations or later in the discussion. To what extent that particular successful example has been picked up by the UN system or UN Office for South-South Cooperation, and the lessons learned made available to other conflict areas. Thank you very much. So with this, we turn to Mr. Deepak. Now you are based in Nepal, and here we are talking about an area of potential. And if we look back at the events of last year, of real conflict building up there, and the tensions, of course, here I'm referring to the interests of your two big neighbors, China and India. I wonder how you look at the possibilities of South-South cooperation, collective and joint action